Hey, look, another topping stack. It's almost like topping an SMSL release products like jelly beans at the Jelly Belly factory. Anyway, we're going to talk about the topping A30 Pro and the D30 Pro stack. Apos Audio was kind enough to send me these products to review in return. Apos and I have a continuing relationship. I'm grateful to them for letting me review gear from time to time. I do not want to shop on Amazon all the time, and I have found that Apos Audio is a good alternative for my audiophile needs. If you're looking for a good option that's not Amazon or eBay, give Apos Audio a chance. They have excellent customer service and competitive prices from everywhere else in the audiophile community. The D30 Pro costs $400. The A30 Pro costs $350. And you can buy the stack for $760 together on Apos Audio. Is this an overpriced combo or the king of the proverbial hill? Both the A30 and D30 have very similar build, and to be honest, they share designs from Topping's recent releases. Both products are encased in aluminum. Neither is heavy, but they do have enough weight so that they sit securely on your desk. Both devices are simple. The D30 has a volume knob that doubles as a menu control, which is very limited because you can only select among the input options. There's an LCD screen. On the back, the D30 has balanced and RCA outputs and inputs for coaxial, optical, and USB. The power switch is also on the back. The A30 has balanced XLR and 4.4mm outputs, along with a standard 1/4-inch output. The volume knob is about the same as the D30. The A30 also has two switches on the front, one to select input and the other to select gain. On the back, the A30 has balanced and RCA input along with RCA and balanced 1/4-inch output. The power switch is on the back as well. There really is not much to say about the build of these products. It's perfectly fine on both and seems quite sturdy. The D30 Pro's marketing spiel is that it has 4 Cirrus Logic DACs from the CS43198 variety. Topping boasts that this provides, quote, spectacular dynamic range and noise reduction. Topping says that this DAC is for, quote, anyone who prioritizes performance above all else. Topping says that the 4 DACs have 2 channels each, resulting in 8 balanced channels. I'm going to stop the hype train right now and say that this is a waste of time, and I'm not going to mention how many channels this DAC has anymore after this. It makes no audible difference at all. The D30 supports all forms of PCM up to DST-256. There is no support for MQA, no Bluetooth, no Wi-Fi, and no dedicated desktop software, something which would have made a dramatic difference if only companies would do it. The D30 has the standard 2 VRMS out of the RCA and 4 VRMS out of the XLR. The A30 Pro's claim to fame is that it has 6 watts into 16 ohms and 5.5 watts into 32 ohms and 840 milliwatts at 300 ohms. The gain switch has a 14 decibel swing. This means that on low gain, the amp will cut 14 decibels. On high gain, the amp will add a maximum of 14 decibels. I assume that the medium gain will give you 7 decibel boost, but Topping really doesn't say. Topping says that the A30 can be used for IEMs, which is something we will talk about later, but I'll just underscore that there is no rational basis to use a powerful amplifier with IEMs. None. At all. The A30 also allows for amp bypass. This means that you can connect your DAC to the A30 and then the A30 to active speakers without adding amplification. However, you will need to have the A30 off if you want to use this as a bypass. Essentially, the A30 will act as a passive pass-through in the event that you need it for your active speakers. Topping also says that when your headphone impedance is 250 ohms or higher, the A30 will work as a Class A amplifier. I don't know how they achieve this, and Topping's manual says nothing about it. I checked a couple of reviews of the A30 Pro and could not find any mention of this Class A delivery system, or even an acknowledgement that it should exist. Topping also touts the THD it achieved with the A30. It's an atomic and irrelevant number of 0.0006%. I may have missed a zero in there somewhere. Topping has a very interesting statement about this measurement. I'm going to quote them directly and let you decide if it makes any sense. Topping says, quote, "To make this concept a bit clearer, let's use an analogy. Imagine that the A30 Pro outputs liquid instead of sound. If you were to pour a soda can's worth of liquid from it, that liquid would be completely pure except for about 0.019 milliliters, or less than the volume of a single droplet. End quote. Topping also says that the A30 Pro has, quote, a stunning 145 decibel of dynamic range. They claim this results in exceptionally realistic playback. Again, I have to stop the hype train. Topping's analogy is not convincing, but besides that, the more important aspect is that this is misleading information. Higher dynamic range makes no difference at all. We humans are incapable of hearing 145 decibels of dynamic range. The threshold of pain is between 120 and 140 decibels of SPL, depending on the frequency and the person. In fact, actual science journals involving actual scientists who conducted actual scientific tests have repeatedly found that the average dynamic range for the human ear is between 100 and 120 decibels. Beyond that, either we cannot differentiate differences or we hit a pain threshold, depending on the individual. The auditory system is capable of differentiating small differences of about 1 decibel, but there is indeed a maximum dynamic range limit. I say all of this to pour a lot of cold water on Topping's questionable claims. Finally, it's a bit strange that Topping decided to use balanced quarter-inch outputs on the D30 Pro. This is the first time I have come across this type of connection, and I'm not quite sure what it serves. I tested the D30 Pro and the A30 Pro separately and then as a stack. I wanted to examine the D30 sound signature. I compared it to my Soundcause LAQX D1, which is about $200 cheaper than the D30. The Soundcause does not have 4 DACs, so let's just see if that makes any audible difference. I used the A30 Pro as the test amplifier. I connected both DACs using their respective RCA outputs. That was controlled using a passive RCA switch box. I connected the Soundcause to my PC and the D30 to my Mac. I played the exact same FLAC files and switched repeatedly to determine any audible differences. For the A30 Pro's test, I used the D30 Pro as my test DAC. I compared the A30 to the Schiit Magni Heresy, which is about $150 cheaper. I connected both amplifiers using a splitter. I played my test playlist and switched back and forth to determine a difference. I used my standard test playlist along with my personal FLAC library. I tested on the Allo Audio S4X, which is the most neutral dynamic driver headphone I've heard. I also tested on the Avotone Planar, which is the most neutral planar magnetic headphone I've heard. The following is a summary of my findings. Let's start with the D30 results. Finally, a Topping DAC that actually sounds different from their other stuff. Look, the Soundcause is neutral. It has neutral tuning. I have compared it against many other DACs, and this has been a consistent finding. When I compared the Soundcause against the SMSO SU9, Topping E30, D50S, and the Cadus tone board, I found that there were very minor differences here and there. But compared against the D30 Pro, the sound is noticeably different. The D30 has a slight bass D emphasis compared to the Soundcause. Mid-bass is also slightly reduced on the D30. Vocals sound marginally clearer on the D30, but also a little bit thinner. Female sibilance and grain is slightly accentuated on the D30 as compared to the Soundcause. Treble instruments tended to sound practically the same between the two DACs. However, on some occasions, it appeared that the D30 had just a tiny bit more clarity among treble instruments. To verify these results, I swapped RCA cables. I tested on the same tracks again and got the same results. I then changed cables again and tried a different position on the AB switch box. The results remained consistent. The D30 Pro is not an analytical DAC. Compared to something like the Monolith THX Desktop or THX Portable or even the Earman TR amp, the D30 Pro sounds fairly neutral. But when directly tested against the Soundcause, a DAC I believe is in fact neutral, the D30 has a more analytical sound. When I tested on different headphones, I got similar results. Whether I played pop, rock, jazz, orchestral, or ambience music, the slight sonic differences were always present. Depending on the track, the differences were sometimes easily noticeable and other times required a bit of additional AB switching to confirm. My overall experience was that the D30 Pro had less bass emphasis. There was slightly greater separation between bass and mids and marginally more clarity throughout the frequency range. When listening to bassy songs, the Soundcause presented more full drums and subwoofer effects. When listening to vocal-centric songs, the Soundcause had warmer, less sibilant vocals. Instruments always had accurate timbre on both amplifiers. It was merely a degree of difference in presentation. The A30 Pro, for example, has slightly greater separation of instruments, but the song cause made them sound more full. I can imagine that someone might say that the song cause has more natural presentation of vocals and instruments, and others might say that the D30 Pro has more clarity, and this is probably true to some extent. But, as I keep mentioning, the alterations are by small margins, not great leaps. Yes, there are noticeable differences, but only upon A/B testing. Also keep in mind that I am purposefully hunting for differences, and so when I hear them, I point them out. The bottom line is that yes, the Soundcause and D30 Pro do sound different. If you're happy with the Soundcause A30, D50, Cadis Tone Board, or the SMSL SU8, SU9, or Sanskrit, you will find that the D30 Pro's performance is as good as those other options, if only a bit different in sound signature. Before anybody starts claiming that the difference in sound signature on the D30 is due to the use of 4 DACs, I'm going to underscore that there is no way to know that. In fact, I would be more inclined to say that the differences are due to DAC tuning rather than the number of DACs shoehorned into the box. Frankly, there is no point in arguing about this. Neither you nor I have any evidence one way or another to demonstrate that multiple DACs make any audible difference. I think it's up to companies like Topping to establish the necessity of this implementation, and since they have not done that here, it's not even worth discussing. Neither DAC, the Soundcause or the D30 Pro, presented any audible noise, so there you go with the vaunted THD numbers. Let us now turn to the A30 Pro. I compared the A30 to the Shit Heresy. I used an AB switch and the D30 Pro as the test DAC. As with a lot of Chinese amplifiers on the market, the audible differences are simply not, well, audible. I switched back and forth between the Heresy and the A30, played around with volume adjustment on the D30, and I heard no differences whatsoever in sound presentation. The Heresy is a fairly neutral amplifier, and the A30 had the exact same sound signature. The bass, mids, and treble all sounded identical. I played and replayed my test tracks over and over again and heard no differences. Pop, rock, orchestral, spoken word, soundtracks, ambience music, every single type of genre I have in my arsenal I tried on these amplifiers. Never once during the course of 3 weeks while I had the Topic amplifier did I hear even an iota of difference between the A30 Pro or the Heresy. Having an AB switch and an RCA splitter really made this decision quite easy. Since I did not have to meddle with switching cables, all I had to do was be mindful of volume matching, and that was easy with my 3.5mm switch box. So, all told, when using the same DAC source and properly volume matched, the A30 Pro sounded identical to the far cheaper Heresy. And by the way, neither amplifier exhibited audible noise or distortion. Topping says that the A30 Pro has 6 watts into 16 ohms, 840 milliwatts at 300 ohms. They say that the A30 Pro is a perfect match for the D30 Pro. I have a question. Who needs 6 watts at 16 ohms? Who needs 5.5 watts into 32 ohms? There is literally no headphone on the market that needs this much power. Yet, Chinese brands keep shoehorning this type of ridiculous power into their gear. I tested the A30 Pro with my Campfire Andromeda, which are 12.8 ohms. Even using the lowest gain setting on the A30, I had to be very, very careful with the volume knob. When I tested other IEMs such as the Moondrop Starfield and Tin Hi-Fi T2, there was a bit more room to adjust volume, but I still had to be careful. I was never able to turn the volume knob beyond 9 o'clock, even on the lowest gain setting. The A30 Pro has plenty of power for every headphone I can think of. This includes the Modhouse Argon and the Beyerdynamic T1 2nd Gen. The Argon requires a minimum of 1 watt into 50 ohms, which the A30 has. The T1 does not need an overabundance of power, but does need a bit more than what a USB dongle DAC can provide. And the T1 does as well on the A30 as it did on the Shit Heresy. As for the Argon, I think it's best to keep the A30 on medium or high gain. Low gain seems to result in slightly muddier sound than the additional gain clears up. Moreover, I never heard channel imbalance on any of the headphones I tested. The volume pot is well tuned, and barring manufacturing defects, you should hear matched channels no matter what volume you set. But there is an obvious problem. As you know, for the past several months, I have reviewed a number of Chinese headphone amplifiers. I have repeatedly found that the manufacturers of those amplifiers have provided misleading power output numbers. The same is true for the A30 Pro. In fact, this time it's a bit nefarious. Topping does not clearly state what DAC voltage they use to achieve the 6 watt, 5.5 watt, and 840 milliwatt numbers. The data is available, but you have to hunt for it, and it is not obvious if you do not know what to look for. One of the graphs that Topping provides shows them using a 5 VRMS DAC. Every DAC with an RCA output will put out either 2 or 2.1 VRMS. The vast majority of DACs which have XLR output provide 4 VRMS. Indeed, Topping's D90, D70, D50S, DS3 Pro, and SMSL SU8 all have no more than 4 VRMS. The Topping D70S and the SMSL SU9 each can provide a maximum of 5 VRMS, according to those companies. Here's the problem. If you do not own either the D70S or the SU9 or some other DAC that has 5 VRMS, then you will never achieve the power output numbers that Topping is claiming. And if you connect via RCA, then you can expect a lot less power than you think you might be getting. The nefarious part is where Topping says that the A30 Pro is a perfect match for the D30 Pro. Since the D30 Pro has a maximum of 4 VRMS, you will not get the full power output that the A30 Pro ostensibly can provide. So, how is the D30 Pro made to pair with the A30? In all honesty, I do not think anybody needs the type of power Chinese companies keep shoveling into their amplifiers. I don't understand why they keep thinking that this is a measure of value. The bottom line is that the A30 Pro has plenty of power for your headphones. But the $100 shit Magni also has plenty of power for most headphones. In fact, I do not know of any headphone that the Magni would have difficulty driving, and this includes the Argon. In the alternative, you could look at the shit Magnus, which is cheaper than the A30 Pro. The Magnus actually provides more power than the A30 Pro without having to resort to 5 VRMS DACs. So, as with other Chinese headphone amplifiers I have reviewed, the numbers initially look impressive, but when you dig into the details, you actually see the truth. The A30 Pro has plenty of power. There's nothing to gripe about in that regard. I just wish Topping would be more honest about how they measure and what the actual power output will be for the matching stack. Every time another Chinese DAC or amp gets released, the less reason I see to buy them. I seriously doubt Chinese brands have any idea what audiophiles actually want. The iterations and reiterations of the same designs with a bit more power in the amps or a different DAC chipset is hardly worth the hype. Topping and SMSL release products like Kraft Foods releases packages of sliced American cheese. Yes, I get it, Chinese brands can outpace the West in manufacturing. Fine, Chinese brands can keep pushing the boundaries for THD and SNR. They can continue to shovel mountain loads of power into their amps. But they still struggle to offer anything new. They're just repeating what has already been done. They might package the newest amp or DAC in shinier, more modern aluminum boxes, but they're not really doing much more than putting lipstick on Peking duck. What do the D30 Pro and A30 Pro do that is so vastly different from their competitors? Well, the D30 has 4 DACs and 8 channels. Whoop-de-doo. I'd love to know how that is supposed to make music sound better. I mean, audibly better, just so we're clear. Are we supposed to believe that last year's Topping or SMSL DACs that did not have 4 DAC chips were 4 times worse than the D30 Pro? Are we to believe that a 12-channel DAC will be more betterer than an 8-channel DAC? What's up with multi-channel DAC implementations anyway? Go to ASR's website if you're so inclined and spend 2 to 3 hours shuffling through their discussions. Try it. Find a link to articles and blind studies on the audible effects of multi-DAC channels. You will find some comments in forums about the efficacy of multi-channel, multi-DAC chipsets, but without anything more than personal, imaginative opinion. And that's the problem. When companies shove 4 DAC chips into their products, some people will get the erroneous impression that the product is better because of the multiple DAC chips. Just once, I would love to see data from Topping or SMSL or any other multi-DAC multi-channel vendor. I'd be quite interested in blind studies conducted by actual scientists. In the absence of this information, I simply cannot find any reason to promote the multi-whatever implementation. The D30 Pro has little to no features of any worth. You don't get Bluetooth, you don't get Wi-Fi, you don't get EQ filters, you don't get MQA. You're limited to DSD-256 on a $400 DAC, might I emphasize, and the screen is a rehash from years ago. The D30 Pro has the typical voltage output, 2 or 4 VRMS. It has pre-out volume adjustment, just like any other DAC. Then we have to turn to the A30 Pro. Look, the A30 Pro is a fine amp. It has plenty of power for your headphones. It comes in a simple design. It sounds exactly the same as the much cheaper Schiit Heresy. Oh, and it has less power than the less expensive Schiit Magnus. There's nothing unique about the A30 Pro either. This brings us to value. No, the topping D30 Pro is absolutely not value. You're getting nothing remotely useful for $400. Forget the nonsensical 4-DAC 8-channel implementation. It has no explicable reason to exist. Yes, the D30 Pro has a slightly different sound signature to neutral DACs such as the Soundcloud's LA-QXD1. I think that's a good thing. Variation in sound is ultimately more choice for the consumer. But to charge $400 for the D30 Pro is both hubris and utterly blind. Take a look at the topping D50S as an example. That product is cheaper than the D30 Pro. It has Bluetooth. It supports resolution up to DSD-512. It has dual DAC implementation in case you believe more DACs means better performance. On the other hand, you're limited to RCA output, but that's par for the DAC course. You have lots of options for DACs well below $400. All of them make the D30 Pro look oddly out of place in the market. The A30 Pro is arguably value, but I think topping is at the very limit of my value assessment. Frankly, I have no idea what topping was thinking when they designed the A30. It's a simple amp that does what any other and cheaper amps do. It can act as a pass-through for your active speakers. Big deal. It has super low THD measurements. I'm not impressed. However, when it comes to actual performance, the daily use scenarios, the A30 Pro works just fine. It is built well and does its job. However, I simply do not see how topping believes the price is justified compared to cheaper alternatives that provide similar or greater power output. I'm also very concerned about topping's marketing. There's something underhanded about the way they're selling this stack. Topping uses a stupid, nonsensical analogy about THD for the A30. They equate the low distortion to water droplets. That's a huge difference. You can actually see, taste, and feel water droplets. You cannot have any sensory input of distortion that is below 1%. You can't hear it. You can't taste it. You can't feel it. You can only imagine it. I have a better analogy for topping. Imagine you have a basket. In that basket, you put all your hopes, dreams, and desires. Over this basket is a very large nylon bag that is inflated by hot air. There you go. That's the proper analogy for THD measurements. It's all hot air that tries to carry your wildest audiophile concepts up into the stratosphere. The bottom line, the one I keep highlighting over and over again in my Chinese DAC and amp reviews, is that THD and SNR measurements are utterly useless. When the distortion is below your ability to hear, then it stops becoming a talking point. It's like saying that one ocean is more wet than another. What are you even talking about? People who argue, hype, and glorify measurements probably find some type of pleasure in the technicalities, and that's fine. But it's not fine to use pointless measurements to promote a product. Those who are familiar with this topic will see it for the joke marketing that it is. But there are plenty of audiophiles who do not know, do not understand, and have been misled by the forums and hype reviewers. Clearly, topping's ridiculously bad marketing is aimed towards those who have already been initiated into the measurement wars. The second problem with topping's marketing is their comments that the A30 and the D30 are meant for each other. Really? How can the A30 achieve the stated power output when it is paired with a D30? It won't. But Topping does not tell you that. The usual reviewers seemingly don't mention that. It's not in Topping's manual. It's one thing to say that this pair is matched, was built around a similar design concept, but that's not what Topping is doing. They're misleading people about the power output of the A30. That's now the typical Chinese grift. Topping has gone a step beyond. Now they specifically tell you to buy a matched DAC that categorically will not get you the power output promised with the matched amplifier. When I talk about value, I ask myself one of two questions. If someone sent me the gear, would I buy it? If I bought the gear, would I keep it? I would never buy the D30 Pro. It is overpriced and has nothing to offer other than a slightly different sound signature and a 4-DAC implementation which lacks any justification. I also would not buy the A30 Pro since I do not see what this amplifier does better in any field. If you want the same neutral performance, buy the cheaper shit Heresy. If you want big power, buy the cheaper shit Magnus. Arguably, the A30 Pro does its job, so while I won't buy it, I don't think people would necessarily make a mistake if they chose it over cheaper options. I know I keep mentioning shit products in these Chinese product reviews, but I can't help it. Shit simply has the same or better performance at a cheaper price. Someone should probably clue Topping and SMSL into this. What Topping should do is create a whole new ecosystem. They need to stop with their monthly cycles and think from the consumer's perspective. Topping or SMSL need to create a dedicated desktop application for their DACs. That application should be a music playback software like Foobar, system-wide EQ adjustment, and cater only to their DACs. Creative Labs has already done part of this with their Sound Blaster software, so it's not like Topping and SMSL have no idea where to start. But for whatever reason, Chinese brands refuse to do this. If you want a DAC, you have plenty of choices. The D30 Pro really should be near the middle of your list. It does nothing exceptional and has no meaningful features to justify its price tag. If you want a headphone amp, the A30 Pro is a fine option. It's as good as its cheaper rivals. But if you're enamored by its physical design, then I suppose you can justify the purchase. In short, the A30 Pro is arguably value. The D30 Pro is not.